The silence in the bedchamber was so complete that Isidora could hear the finality in her husband's footsteps as he walked away from her. She stood in the center of the vast room, still wearing her wedding gown, the lace sleeves trembling against her wrists. The candles had burned low, and the fire in the grate had faded to a bed of orange embers. Alexander Montclair, the Duke of Ashwick, had not even looked back. His words still hung in the air, sharp and cold as broken glass. This union is a matter of convenience, nothing more. Do not expect affection from me. I married you because it was necessary, not because I desired a wife. You will have every comfort this estate provides, but my heart is not part of the arrangement. I trust you understand. She had opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. He had already turned, his broad shoulders stiff beneath his dark coat, and walked out of the room without another glance. The door had clicked shut with a soft, devastating certainty. Isidora had remained motionless long after his footsteps faded down the corridor. Her chest ached with a pain she had no name for. She had known the marriage was arranged, hurried, but somewhere deep inside her a tiny seed of hope had dared to sprout. That hope withered now, scorched by the cold reality of his rejection. She was a transaction, a piece of property, nothing more. She did not weep that night. She was too stunned, too hollow. She simply sat on the edge of the great canopied bed, still and silent, while the hours crawled toward dawn. Outside the window, the first pale light of morning touched the rolling hills of Ashwick Hall, but she felt none of its warmth. The second blow fell the very next morning. Unable to sleep, Isidora had risen early and wandered through the unfamiliar corridors, her slippers whispering over polished oak floors. She had hoped to learn the shape of her new prison, to find some quiet corner where she could gather her shattered composure. As she passed the door of the library, which stood slightly ajar, she heard her husband's voice. He was speaking to his steward, Mr. Pemberton, a thin, gray-haired man with a kind face she had glimpsed briefly at the wedding breakfast. Isidora froze, her hand hovering near the doorframe, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to move away. "The marriage was a necessary transaction, Pemberton," the Duke said, his tone brisk and unfeeling. "Her father's situation left me little choice, but it is done. See to it that the Duchess is made comfortable and kept occupied. I do not wish to be disturbed with domestic trivialities." "Of course, Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton replied quietly. Isidora's heart turned to stone. Not only had he spoken those cruel words to her in private, but he repeated them to his servants as though she were a shipment of grain, a ledger entry to be settled and forgotten. She pressed her hand to her mouth and fled silently back to her room, her vision blurring with unshed tears. That was the moment the hope inside her truly died. The first months at Ashwick Hall passed in a haze of quiet desperation. The estate was beautiful, sprawling across green valleys and ancient woodlands, but to Isidora it felt like a gilded cage. The Duke was rarely present. When he did appear at meals, he was distant and monosyllabic. He sat at the head of the long dining table, a newspaper or a stack of correspondence beside his plate, and he never once asked her about her day or her thoughts. She might as well have been a painting on the wall. Still, some fragile, stubborn part of her tried. She had been raised to believe that a wife's duty was to cultivate harmony, to nurture affection. So she gathered wildflowers from the gardens and placed them in a small vase on his desk. She left a book of poetry she thought he might enjoy on the arm of his chair. She waited for him every evening in the drawing room, dressed in her finest gowns, a pot of tea growing cold on the table, hoping he might join her. He never did. One afternoon, she overheard the housekeeper, Mrs. Hargrove, speaking to a maid in the hallway. The older woman's voice was heavy with disapproval. "The late Duchess always knew how to manage the household with such grace," Mrs. Hargrove said. "She never left things to chance. This new one, she drifts about like a ghost, rearranging flowers as if that matters. It's a shame His Grace had to settle for so little." Isidora's cheeks burned. She waited until their footsteps faded before she allowed herself to breathe. The late Duchess. She had known Alexander was a widower, of course, but no one had spoken of his first wife. Now the comparison cut deep, a reminder that she was not only unwanted but found wanting. She withdrew to her room and stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for some flaw, some reason she was so easy to dismiss. She found none, and somehow that was worse. The turning point came on a gray November afternoon, 3 months into her marriage. Isadora had been wandering the grounds, trying to escape the suffocating silence of the house, when she encountered Mr. Pemberton near the home farm. He was inspecting a broken fence, his brow furrowed with worry. "Your Grace," he said, tipping his hat, "forgive me, I did not expect to see you so far from the hall." "I needed air," she replied, forcing a small smile. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated, then sighed. "The tenant farms have been neglected for some time. His Grace has been consumed with matters in London, and the land has suffered. Several families are struggling. I do what I can, but—" He trailed off, looking at the damp, unplowed fields. Something stirred inside Isadora, a faint spark of purpose. "Show me," she said. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into learning the workings of the estate. Mr. Pemberton, initially cautious, soon warmed to her genuine interest. She visited every cottage, sat at kitchen tables, listened to the tenants' worries. She discovered a family with a sick child and sent for the physician. She organized repairs for a leaking roof that had been ignored for over a year. She sorted through the ledgers and found discrepancies, small savings that could be redirected to those who needed them most. The tenants began to look at her with something new in their eyes: gratitude, respect, warmth. They called her the kind Duchess, and their children would run to greet her when she walked through the village. For the first time since her wedding night, Isadora felt seen, not as a transaction but as a person of value. She stopped waiting in the drawing room in the evenings. She stopped arranging flowers on the Duke's desk. She stopped hopping for a glance or a kind word. The love she had wanted to give had nowhere to go, so she poured it into the land and its people instead. Her heart, once so raw and open, began to grow a protective shell. She found an empty cottage on the edge of the estate and, with the tenants' help, transformed it into a small schoolroom. She taught the children their letters and numbers, read them stories, watched their faces light up with curiosity. Their laughter filled a space inside her that had been hollow for months. She no longer dressed for dinner. She ate early at the schoolhouse, sharing bread and cheese with the little ones, and returned to the hall only after dark. The Duke, if he noticed her absence, said nothing. But he did notice. Alexander Montclair was not a man accustomed to examining his own feelings, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of his home. At first, it was a vague irritation. The Duchess was never present when he returned from his study. The dining table, once graced by her silent but steady presence, now sat empty in the evenings. He found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridor, the soft rustle of her skirts, and hearing only silence. One evening he asked his butler, "Where is her Grace?" The butler hesitated. "I believe she is at the village school, Your Grace. She often takes her supper there." The Duke frowned. "Every evening?" "Yes, Your Grace." A strange, uncomfortable sensation settled in his chest. He dismissed the butler and stood by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. He had wanted distance, had demanded it, but now that he had it in abundance, it felt wrong. He shook off the feeling. It was nothing. She was merely occupying herself as he had instructed. That was all. The arrival of Lord Henry Stanton shattered his carefully constructed indifference. Henry was an old friend from Alexander's university days, a charming, golden-haired baron with an easy laugh and a knack for making people adore him. He arrived at Ashwick Hall in late spring, ostensibly to discuss a business venture, but it became clear within hours that his interest lay elsewhere. He had met Isadora once before, during her first London season, and he greeted her with a warmth that bordered on familiarity. "Isadora, good heavens, you've grown even lovelier," he exclaimed, bowing over her hand and holding it a fraction longer than necessary. I was devastated to hear you'd been snatched away to the wilds of Ashwick. The ton has been dreadfully dull without you." Isadora smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face in a way Alexander had never seen. "Lord Henry, you flatter me shamelessly. It's good to see a friendly face." Alexander stood a few paces away, his jaw tight. He watched as his wife laughed at something Henry whispered, watched as her hand rested lightly on the Baron's arm. A hot, unfamiliar emotion coiled in his gut. Jealousy. It was sharp and ugly, and it took him entirely by surprise. At dinner that evening, Henry dominated the conversation, regaling Isadora with tales of London gossip, making her chuckle and shake her head. She looked relaxed, animated, utterly at ease. Alexander sat at the head of the table, a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. He pushed his food around his plate and said little. Neither of them seemed to notice. After the meal, Henry turned to Isadora with a boyish grin. "You promised to show me the rose gardens, Your Grace. I've heard they're magnificent this time of year." "They are," she said warmly. "Come, I'll take you." Alexander's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. "It's growing dark," he said, his voice clipped. "The paths are uneven." Isadora looked at him with cool, level eyes. "I know the gardens well, Your Grace. We won't be long." She swept out of the room with Henry at her side, leaving Alexander standing alone in the candlelight, his fists clenched at his sides. He followed them. He told himself he was simply walking off his restless energy, but his steps carried him to the garden terrace where he stood in the shadows and watched. Isadora and Henry were strolling along the gravel path, their silhouettes framed by the last blush of sunset. Henry said something that made her laugh, a light musical sound that drifted up to the terrace. She tilted her head back, her hair catching the golden light, and Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. He had never made her laugh like that. He had never even tried. When she returned to the house an hour later, he was waiting in the corridor outside her chambers. She stopped when she saw him, her expression carefully neutral. "Did you enjoy your walk?" he asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "Very much," she replied. "Lord Henry is excellent company. He is a notorious flirt." Isadora's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "It is pleasant to be seen, Your Grace, to be spoken to as if one's words matter. You, of all people, should understand the value of a transaction. My time with Lord Henry costs you nothing." The words hit him like a physical blow. She curtsied, perfectly polite, and entered her room, closing the door gently behind her. Alexander stood in the corridor, stunned and hollow. She had thrown his own cruelty back at him, and he had no defense. He had called her a transaction, and now she was showing him exactly what that meant. She would be his duchess in name, but her warmth, her laughter, her heart, those belonged to no one, least of all to him. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, staring at the cold fireplace, and replayed every cold word he had ever spoken to her. He saw her face on their wedding night, the way hope had drained from her eyes. He remembered the flowers she had left on his desk, the tea growing cold in the drawing room, all the small, tender gestures he had ignored. A slow, creeping regret began to gnaw at his conscience. He had pushed her away, and she had gone. Not physically, she was still beneath his roof, but the woman who had once looked at him with shy, hopeful eyes was gone. The next morning, he found Lord Henry in the breakfast room and informed him, with icy politeness, that urgent business required the Baron's immediate return to London. Henry raised an eyebrow but did not argue. Before he departed, he sought out Isadora in the schoolhouse. She was wiping chalk from a small blackboard when he appeared in the doorway. He looked at the rows of little benches, the children's drawings pinned to the walls, and his expression softened with something like sorrow. "You deserve more than this, Isadora," he said quietly. "More than a cold house and a man who doesn't see you." She set down the cloth and met his gaze. "I have made a life here, Henry. It is not the one I dreamed of, but it is mine." He took her hand and pressed it briefly. "If you ever need a friend, I am always here." She thanked him and watched him ride away, a small ache in her heart, not for Henry himself, but for the kindness he represented, a reminder that she was still capable of being valued, even if her husband could not see it. The weeks that followed were strained. Alexander began to make halting, awkward attempts to bridge the chasm between them. He appeared at the schoolhouse one afternoon, standing stiffly in the doorway while the children gaped at the Duke in their midst. He offered to help repair a broken window, and though his hands were clumsy with the work, he stayed until it was done. Isadora watched him with wary eyes, unsure what to make of this sudden attention. He joined her for dinner one evening, unbidden. The meal was quiet, but he asked her about the tenants, about the school. She answered politely, but the warmth was gone from her voice. It was the voice of a stranger making conversation, and it chilled him to the bone. "Isadora," he said, setting down his fork, I know I have not been the husband you deserved." She looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "You made your position clear, Your Grace. I have learned to live within its boundaries. There is no need to revisit the matter." "But I want to revisit it," he pressed, leaning forward. "I want—" "You want," she interrupted softly, "because I have stopped wanting. That is the way of such things, is it not? The heart grows tired of waiting, and eventually it simply rests." She rose from the table, her plate barely touched. "Good night, Your Grace." He watched her leave, and the fear that had been lurking at the edges of his mind took hold. He was losing her, not to another man but to her own hard-won peace. She no longer needed him, and the realization was a slow, agonizing death. The fever came in early autumn. It swept through the tenant village like a wildfire, striking down the young and old alike. The local physician was overwhelmed. Isadora did not hesitate. She gathered supplies, summoned every able-bodied servant, and went to the village herself. When Alexander learned of her intentions, he intercepted her in the great hall, his face pale with alarm. "You will not go," he said, his voice tight with command. "It's too dangerous, I forbid it." She met his eyes with a calm that was far more powerful than anger. "Those people are my responsibility. I will not abandon them for your peace of mind. Forbid me if you like, Alexander. It will change nothing." She walked past him and out the door. He stood frozen, her use of his Christian name echoing in his ears. It was the first time she had said it since their wedding night. He had wanted to hear it for so long, but not like this, not as a quiet declaration of war. For 3 days, Isadora worked without rest. She bathed feverish foreheads, spooned broth into trembling mouths, held the hands of the frightened. She barely ate, barely slept. The tenants looked at her with a devotion that bordered on reverence. She was not just their duchess, she was their guardian angel. Alexander came to the village several times, his face drawn with worry. He tried to pull her away to make her rest, but she refused. "There are still so many who need help," she said, her voice hoarse. "I cannot stop now." On the 4th day she collapsed. One moment she was bending over a sick child, and the next she was on the floor, her skin burning, her body limp. Alexander reached her before anyone else. He gathered her into his arms, her weight terrifyingly slight, and carried her back to Ashwick Hall with a desperation that bordered on madness. The physician was summoned. The diagnosis was grim. The fever had taken hold of her, and her exhausted body had little strength left to fight. Alexander refused to leave her side. He sent away the servants who offered to sit with her. He bathed her forehead himself, his hands trembling as he brushed the damp hair from her face. The great, cold Duke, who had built walls around his heart for so many years, sat in a chair beside her bed and did not move for 3 days and 3 nights. He barely ate. He did not sleep. He simply watched her, listened to her labored breathing, and felt the terror of losing something he had only just realized he could not live without. In her delirium, Isadora spoke. Her voice was a thin, fevered whisper, but every word cut him like a blade. "A transaction," she murmured, her head turning restlessly on the pillow. "He said I was nothing more. I just wanted him to look at me, just once." Alexander's composure shattered. He buried his face in his hands, and the tears he had not shed since childhood fell hot and silent. "Forgive me," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Forgive me, Isidora, I am a fool. I have been blind and cruel and so terribly afraid. Please, please don't leave me." She did not hear him. She was lost in the fever, adrift in a sea of pain. But he kept speaking, whispering confessions into the stillness of the room, as if his words could tether her to life. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Isidora opened her eyes to pale morning light and the sight of her husband slumped in a chair beside her bed. He looked haggard, unshaven, his cravat undone, dark shadows beneath his eyes. When he saw her stir, he straightened with a gasp, and something raw and unguarded flooded his expression. Relief, gratitude, love. "Isidora," he breathed, "thank God." She blinked, her mind sluggish. "Alexander." He took her hand, his grip gentle but fierce. "I thought I had lost you. I thought—" He stopped, his voice failing. He swallowed hard and began again. "There are things I must tell you, things I should have said long ago." She watched him, too weak to speak, but her eyes held a glimmer of curiosity, of cautious hope. "I did not marry you because of a transaction," he said, his voice raw. "I told you that, but it was a lie I told myself so I would not have to face the truth." He drew a shaking breath. "2 years ago I saw you at a ball in London. You were laughing with your friends, and there was a light in you that I had not seen in anyone for years. I watched you all evening. I did not even know your name, but I could not look away. I asked about you. I learned who you were. And I knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that you were someone who could break through the darkness I had lived in for so long." She listened, her lips parted, her heart beginning to pound. "I was a widower," he continued. "My first wife, I must tell you the truth of that as well. She was my childhood friend, a kind and gentle soul who was dying of consumption. She asked me to marry her so she could spend her final months with dignity, with a name and a home. I agreed out of duty, not love. There was no grand romance, no passion. I mourned her death, yes, but I never truly loved her the way a husband should. I thought, after she died, that I was incapable of that kind of love. I believed my heart had been sealed away forever." He took her other hand, holding both as if she were made of glass. "Then I saw you, and I was terrified. I did not think I deserved you. I was cold and broken, and you were so full of life, so I stayed away." "Then what changed?" she whispered. "Your father," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "He had made terrible mistakes. He had embezzled funds from his employer, and the scandal was about to break. It would have ruined your family, destroyed your reputation, left you with nothing. I could not bear it. I intervened. I paid the debt secretly, covered the scandal, and offered for your hand to protect you. But I let you believe it was a cold arrangement because I was too much of a coward to tell you the truth. I thought if I kept my distance I would not risk my heart. I thought I could exist beside you without loving you. I was a fool." Isidora's eyes filled with tears. "All this time you loved me." "From the very first moment I saw you," he said, his voice cracking. "And I have been a wretched, miserable fool. I let my fear turn me into a monster. I broke your heart. I pushed you away until you stopped caring. And when I saw you with Henry, when I thought I might lose you to him, I nearly went mad. But the truth is, I lost you long before he ever arrived. I lost you with every cold word, every ignored gesture, every night I left you alone." He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers. "I am so sorry, Isidora. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn it if you will let me." The tears spilled down her cheeks. She felt the shell around her heart crack, and all the pain and longing she had buried for so long rushed to the surface. She had built walls of her own, had taught herself to live without hope, but now hope was flooding back, terrifying and beautiful. "I loved you," she said, her voice trembling. "From the moment we met at the altar, I wanted to love you. I tried so hard, and when you threw it back at me, I thought I would shatter. I had to stop loving you to survive." "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I am so sorry." She reached up with a weak hand and touched his unshaven cheek. I do not know if I can trust you again so quickly. I am afraid, Alexander. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Then let me be patient. Let me prove myself day by day. I will not rush you. I only ask that you do not close the door entirely. That is all I ask. She searched his face, and what she saw there was not the cold, distant Duke she had married. It was a man stripped of his armor, vulnerable and desperate and achingly sincere. Her heart, battered but still beating, whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. The door is not closed, she said softly. The relief that washed over his features was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, and for a long moment they simply breathed together, the silence no longer a wound but a beginning. The days of recovery were slow and tender. Alexander did not leave her side. He read to her, brought her trays of food he had asked the cook to prepare himself, and sat with her in the garden when she was strong enough to walk. He visited the schoolhouse with her and met the children, learning their names, listening to their lessons. The tenants saw a transformation in him, a softening, a warmth that had never been there before. They whispered that the Duchess had worked a miracle. Isadora did not rush into his arms. She needed time to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But she let him in, a little more each day. She began to see the man behind the cold facade, the man who had been wounded by duty and loss, who had been so afraid of pain that he had inflicted it instead. And she saw the fierce, protective love that had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of fear. One evening, as autumn painted the woods in shades of gold and crimson, they walked together through the gardens where she had once walked with Henry. The air was crisp, and the last roses clung to their bushes, fading but still beautiful. Alexander stopped and turned to face her, his dark eyes soft. "Isadora," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know I have said it before, but I need to say it again. I love you. Not because you are my Duchess, not because of duty or obligation. I love you because you are the bravest, kindest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You came into this cold house and you filled it with light, even when I tried to snuff it out. You gave love to my tenants when I gave you none. You built a school and taught children to hope. You saved yourself when I failed you. And you saved me too." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "You saved yourself, Alexander. I only held the door open." He smiled, a true smile that transformed his stern features. "Then let me hold it open for you for the rest of our lives. No more distance, no more silence. I want to know you, every part of you. I want to be the man who makes you laugh, the man you come home to, the man who stands beside you in the schoolhouse and the village and everywhere else, if you will have me." She stepped closer, her hand finding his. The last of her walls crumbled, and she let the love she had buried rise up, fierce and bright. "I will have you," she whispered. "All of you. The past and the present and the future. I have waited so long to hear those words." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle as a prayer, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of reverence, of gratitude, of a promise that would never be broken. When they parted, she was smiling through her tears, and he was holding her as if he would never let go. Months passed, and the wounds healed into scars that were tender but no longer painful. The schoolhouse thrived, and Alexander became a familiar presence there, reading stories to wide-eyed children and helping to mend desks. The tenants prospered under their care. Ashwick Hall, once a place of silence and shadows, echoed with laughter and the warmth of a love-hard one. On a spring morning, a year after her illness, Isadora stood in the garden, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was expecting their first child, a secret she had told him only the night before, and the joy in his eyes had been a memory she would treasure forever. He came up behind her now, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. "I am thinking that I once believed I would never be loved," she said. "And now I am so full of love I hardly know what to do with it." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then give it away as you always have. to the children, to the tenants, to me, and I will spend every day giving it back to you." She turned in his arms and looked up at the husband she had once called a stranger. His eyes held no coldness now, only a deep, steady devotion. He had once called her a transaction. Now she was his entire world, and for the first time. She did not need to hear the words to know she was loved, but he whispered them anyway, just to watch her smile. "I love you, Isadora Montclair. I love you, Alexander." And the gardens of Ashwick Hall bloomed around them, full of life, full of hope, full of a future neither of them had dared to dream.